Great. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for our panel on sustainable capitalism. What does it actually mean and how do we get there? I'm Vijay, Vaitheeswaran. I'm the US business editor for The Economist. It's my great pleasure to be your immoderate moderator for this session. We have three fantastic panelists with us, whom I'll introduce now. Judith Rodin, who is former president of the Rockefeller Foundation, as well as of the University of Pennsylvania, and an expert on the topic. Thank you for joining us. We have, to her right, Edmund Phelps, Nobel Prize winner in economics, professor here at Columbia, distinguished thinker on this topic and others we'll get to in a moment. And we have, on a very timely day, with us Ambassador Marc-André Blanchard, Canada's permanent representative to the UN, as well as numerous other hats at the United Nations involving the new NAFTA and so on. So we'll ask for your thoughts as well in due course. The topic could not be more timely, it seems to me. The question of rethinking capitalism is very much on the minds of not only companies, but really political candidates, for example, in the US presidential race. Really, a lot of the elections that are going on, not only in Canada today, but in other parts of the world, could be seen as, in some ways, a vote on a view of the future. On a verdict on a particular kind of capitalism that has prevailed and what direction we may want to see it go forward. We are seeing this, for example, with the Business Roundtable of leading American chief executives who came out recently in a remarkable statement that, in a sense, goes beyond what was a shareholder value paradigm that has held in US capitalism for several decades, stating that they are going to look after stakeholders' values, not only immediate shareholders. It appears to be, at least on face value, we need to see how it's implemented, a rethinking of Milton Friedman's seminal and quite influential way of thinking about the role of the firm and capitalism in America, which has been taught at business schools, including the one here on campus at Columbia. And so, are we at a crossroads? Is this a new moment in capitalism? And why would this be? And is business really the right kind of foot soldier? Are CEOs the right, let's say, figures in society to advance what might be called sustainable capitalism? Let's start with you, if Judith Rodin. Could you give us your perspective?
I think it's... I'm sorry. I think certainly we're witnessing an evolution, not a revolution. This is not some dichotomous moment when suddenly CEOs woke up and people started thinking about capitalism in new ways. I think when you look at the ethos of investing over the last 20 years, certainly the initial view of do no harm led to the concern about investing in cigarette company stocks or South Africa during apartheid, and that was a wave of activism that said we can use the way we invest and control capital to move social progress in certain directions or move political action in certain directions. I think about 15 years ago, the field of impact investing was really launched. Actually, the term was...
Rockefeller played an important role.
Yes, Rockefeller hosted the conference at which the term impact investing was crowned as the double bottom line investment strategies. So that moving from do no harm, the argument here was that you could have investments that returned robust financial returns, but also could have social or environmental impact. And that field has really matured over the last 10 or 15 years. There's about $12 trillion now under management in what is called a double bottom line or impact investment. It's in all asset classes, public and private equities, venture capital, certainly the debt market, both public and private. And so that maturation has really, and the returns that are now starting to be so clearly demonstrated, push the notion that one doesn't have to take a haircut to bring good social and environmental outcomes while seeking financial returns. But I would say about 5 or 6 years ago, the sea change that we're talking about now, where we really began to see corporate CEOs talking about sustainable capitalism, people arguing that focus on quarterly earnings was really making us short-sighted, and that both CEOs and investors ought to take a longer-term view to returns. Pension funds got interested as some countries actually changed in the US ERISA requirements or other fiduciary requirements that actually enabled them to make these kinds of investments more actively and more strategically. And the whole field of social impact bonds exploded. So the green bond market, resilience bonds, social impact bonds, which were began and tested in the UK. Again, Rockefeller played a key role in the launching of those, but now there are social impact bonds in 19 countries doing everything from juvenile recidivism to juvenile diabetes. So what we're seeing is the maturation, the broadening of this market in a very significant way. The other major change, I would say, is that we see activist employees and activist consumers pushing the CEOs. So from Larry Fink's original newsletter, which got a lot of attention in terms of how BlackRock would look for ESG, the whole notion of environmental and social goals, where it's not only profit and shareholder return, but stakeholder return, employee return, in non-quantitative ways, not in cash, but in a variety of other really important outcomes. We see consumers, I think led by millennials, not willing to buy products from companies that they think are doing the wrong thing or doing things in the wrong way. And that is having an impact on the CEO as well. And then let's not forget the G in ESG, because there's so much more attention to governance. You know, it used to be at annual meetings of large companies, you would have what often was perceived by the CEO and the board to be sort of fringe activists making statements that the board always turned down. Well, that is changing dramatically, both who appears at annual meetings and how seriously the boards are actually taking the intervention. And then finally, I think with the Sustainable Development Goals, and I know Ambassador Blanchard will talk about that, and your leadership and Canada's role in this, I think, has been critical, Mr. Ambassador. But it was very clear to those of us who spent a lot of time laboring over the SDGs that there wasn't enough capital in government, in foundations, in the traditional sources of capital for development goals, and that unless we broadly and deeply engaged private capital, engaged the markets in helping to finance the Sustainable Development Goals, not as an act of charity, but as investment in building sustainable markets in areas that before had been seen as only funded by government or philanthropy. And we believe, and Rockefeller strongly engaged in our actions in this attitude, that you can't make change here without engaging markets, because you don't have enough resources in what government is doing and what philanthropy is doing. You must bring capitalism in, and you must transform the way markets work to benefit everyone in order to get sustainable and long-term social and environmental change. So that's a kind of brief survey of the field from the vantage point in which I've seen it, both as a philanthropist, as somebody who sat on two very large investment committees, Penn's and Rockefeller's, and somebody who served on 9 public company boards.
Great. Dr. Rodin, thank you. So a clear sense from you, from where you sit, that there is a change, that sustainable capitalism does have a meaning, and from where you sit, it has an important role for market actors, for private capital, but perhaps with some of the governance, some of the guardrails or incentives reshaped in a way than perhaps in an era prior. And that's where you see the roles perhaps for government, for philanthropy, and for some of the innovations that you've helped champion. Let's turn to Professor Phelps. Can we have your thoughts on the subject, sir?
Well, I don't have any thoughts much on this kind of investing. I understood.
But more broadly,
Yeah, more broadly, I do want to talk about what you might call equitable capitalism, right? Yeah. I think the worst inequity is the deplorably low wage rates that are paid to workers at the low end of the workforce, the labor force. And I've been surprised and almost shaken that politicians have been in recent months extremely focused on the middle voter, as if they had to capture the middle voter in order to get reelected or get elected. And of course, that's probably in large part what it's about. But I so wish that these politicians who are so very smart and so eloquent would have oriented themselves toward workers at the low end of the spectrum, rather than workers in the middle. And here I've been strongly influenced by John Rawls in his book, A Theory of Justice. And there it's argued that we ought to be putting all the revenues that we can raise and we can spare. Wasn't too clear about that latter part, but all the revenue we can lay our hands on to pull up wage rates at the bottom as far as we can do. How could it be unjust to leave that unaddressed or leave some slack there when we could do more? So now, it's true that the U.S. government has instituted, a long time ago now, the Earned Income Tax Credit. And that was rammed through Congress and President Lyndon Johnson by the redoubtable Wilbur Mills a long time ago. And that was, to be sure, a great idea. But unfortunately, over the years, it became more and more a tool for helping out. I don't mean to be crude, and I can't be very exact because I'm not working in this area anymore, but it was used to support women, especially women with young children at home. And there wasn't anything left really for men. And I think you can put the blame on that for the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of men in prison because to make a living they did some things like drug dealing that was illegal. And I think this is one of the tragedies we have in this country, that we haven't had the sense of justice that would require addressing the needs of men among the least advantaged. And by the way, I was working for a month or so at the OECD in Paris, working on a proposal to raise additional money for subsidies to, it's a little more complicated than this, but to raise subsidy, to collect money from taxes to subsidize the employment of workers at the bottom in order to pull up wage rates of people, men and women, equally at the bottom. And I was making great progress and being on the verge of being very proud of such an accomplishment when it was shot down by President Clinton and his administration. Why? Well, it was explained to me that they were afraid that the money would be taken out of the money that was going to women, rather than so. Well, now, in those days, there was enormous concern about not trying to raise much more tax revenue than we've already done. It's skepticism about whether it could be raised, political unwillingness to raise more. And now, isn't it amazing? Suddenly, we're running tremendous deficits, and we've also, over the years, raised tax rates quite a lot. I think that, and what is being said now in the run-up for the presidential election is what is being said is that we can raise a ton of additional money for this, that, and the other thing. And again, there is no mention among the would-be presidential contenders, no mention of raising money for subsidies to people at the low end.
So, Professor Phelps,
yes.
I think in fairness, I think some candidates do have ideas on focusing on the lower end of the spectrum, but I think it's fair what you said, that often the middle class is where people look for votes, and so the political point you make is certainly valid. If I could maybe dig a little bit into your the question of the hour. You said you wanted to reframe the conversation from sustainable capitalism to really talk about inequity and justice. You brought up Rawls, of course. Do you believe the form of capitalism that has prevailed in the U.S. in recent decades needs to be modified or changed dramatically to achieve a more just society?
Other than the subject of
the wages,
the wage distribution,
of the lowest 10%
other
or
than
15%.
That.
Other than that, is there a broader? Because people who advocate for a sustainable capitalism talk about a role for example, the private corporation going beyond merely serving their fiduciary duties to immediate shareholders. They talk about the role in climate change, which is a frequent topic of discussion during UN Week here a few weeks ago. They talk about a much broader role for investments and so on.
Yeah, I was going to wind up by saying that this is one of the outstanding failures of the public sector. What I had in mind was immediately the environment. The environment is another outstanding failure of the public sector. But your question, I think, was about a just capitalism, and you're wondering whether there were some features of that other than the feature of it that I was talking about. I don't know whether justice is the right word, but certainly there are failings in the way that corporations are organized and the incentives. Yes, I think what it perhaps is the most important thing to say swims into my head, namely, so now I forget what it was. We're going to tape this though.
Sure. Well, I mean, among the...
Okay, I got it. The corporations, the management of the corporations are structured in such a way that the CEO has the prospect of a long time in office, and then if he does quite well, as these things are measured, then he will get a whopping bonus. But I think that has the effect that the CEOs don't want to take much risk. So I think one can argue successfully that society would rather that the CEOs be much more bold. And we're going to be talking about boldness later. But this is a place where we see a lack of boldness, where we see an excess of care, sort of a stultifying, almost a stultification. So that is something that's got to be addressed.
That's an interesting point. I want to come to you for a comment on this in a moment, Dr. Rodin. But the traditional critique of capitalism by those concerned about, say, sustainability is that, in fact, CEOs are too short-termist, that the quarterly results they need to match the number that analysts expect on earnings per share. We're in the middle of earnings season at the moment. That in fact, even attempts to provide bonuses and other incentives for long-term alignment haven't worked adequately in American shareholder capitalism. Again, the CEOs at the Business Roundtable last year said we want to encourage our member companies. They didn't force them, to encourage them to abandon quarterly reporting, which is not the norm in Europe, for example, because right, and guidance, exactly, guidance particularly, because it makes companies operate to a short-term metric. But you point to a different concern of yours that actually another distinguished economist, Tyler Cowen, has also written about, that a class of CEOs, a generation, has come to a point in America the last 20, 30 years of lacking ambition, not taking on broader vision for longer-term projects. An exception he points out to, and I've written about it in The Economist, is someone like Elon Musk, who takes on grander societal challenges, but he notably has little concern for shareholders' returns in the short term and has been called out for that. But leave that exception aside. I wondered that perhaps this dovetails with your more recent research on innovation, that for various reasons, that we're seeing American capitalism become less innovative, less creative, in part because of some of these factors. Is that more of where you're going with this critique? It's not quite on the point with equality or sustainability, but I do see it connecting with the point about innovation.
Well, I'm sure I've made some other points that would go under that rubric. My main emphasis has been that. And I don't want to get into my future material, but my main emphasis is that the trouble with the performance of the economy, I think, is not some sort of institutional flaw, some sort of something that needs some loose bolt or some rusty part, or something that needs to be fixed in the institutional structure. I think the fault is in the people. Americans are not the same sort of people that they were 100 years ago when Abraham Lincoln was bowled over by the passion for novelty. And
And by people, do you mean CEOs or do you mean consumers? All of us?
He met all of us, yes,
Okay.
all of us.
All right, let me give Dr. Rodin a chance to
Not
jump in. I know
not excluding
you've
CEOs,
been wanting
of
to
course.
jump in and make a quick comment. If I can ask for some comment with the microphone, please. And then we're going to come to the ambassador in a moment.
And I'll be very quick. And I do think that when people talk about sustainable capitalism and making markets work better, they are also talking about inequity and the people at the bottom of the pyramid. And certainly that's been the way the governments and philanthropy and many of the lead CEOs have talked about. I don't see it as a European-US divide. I actually think if you look at innovation in the United States and you see the explosion of both computer technology, all the STEM technologies, biotechnology, the cycle of innovation, if anything, is accelerated. But it's not coming from the CEOs of the big companies. Those companies get big if they're successful, and that's been part of the rhythm of all of this. And the companies that have gotten big have very few employees relative to how traditional companies really operated. And I think that's part of the problem, that when we think about the future economy and we think about the future of work, we are able to do so much more with so many fewer people. How do we ever come to terms with all of that? I do think CEOs are quite conservative. I don't see the kind of wild-eyed, except when it's your own company. You can talk about Elon Musk or, whenever somebody owns X% of the company, but other than that, I think there really is a timidity. Again, I don't see it as a European versus US. If anything, I think European CEOs are even more handcuffed and are more timid than many of the CEOs in the United States, watching both of those boards. But we can think of great examples. I think of Paul Pullman at Unilever as a wonderful example, newly retired, but with a career in which at the end of the work that Unilever did, they spent more money and more time thinking about the farmers and all of their suppliers at the front end of the value chain of all of their products. And their interventions were significant and brilliant than they did about shareholder value, and they got punished for it. Remember Indra Nooyi, when she became the CEO of Pepsi-Cola, initially wanted to get off all of their, quote, bad products, their sugared products, their high-fat products. The markets punished her for that. But we're seeing a transformation, I hope. We'll see where that goes, in which more entities and more parts of the ecosystem think that's bad, and therefore are willing to shift.
So we've talked about investors, we've talked about role of markets and business. Let's turn to the ambassador. Can you give us your perspective on perhaps the role of governments and international organizations, and more broadly, how do you look at this question of sustainable capitalism?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very proud to and happy to be part of this great panel. And just to continue on what you've said, Dr. Rodin, I actually believe you said it's an evolution, it's not a revolution. I think the revolution is about to come, personally. I think that the power of consumers is getting, is being heard more and more. When you see, and I think two things will do that, the climate change imperative and the inequality issue. And I think the first one will probably, the first big trigger is the climate change imperative. And by that I mean, like, the people are feeling it when you have school children striking for it, and like the biggest protest we've had in Montreal ever was on a few Fridays ago with Greta Thunberg, and this is a movement that is going. And I think the market will penalize, and it has started. We've seen that, on various stock exchanges where companies that are perceived in not being sustainable on the right. I mean, you've given some examples of some CEOs that were before their time. I actually believe that we now see some the market is actually punishing some of the companies that are not, they're not thinking that is green enough or in the right direction or sustainable enough. And the more you'll have that, the more you'll have a better alignment of capital with sustainable development. I can tell you, I started making, you all both know way more about these things than I do, but I started being very focused on this 3 or 4 years ago when I was appointed to the UN. And I remember my first speeches to pension funds. And they were taught, when I said to them, you know, our society has decided to put the hands of the capital in your hands. So don't ask governments, because I know, I was in the private sector 4 years ago, I'm now in the public sector. Governments have very little resources to actually impact climate change, or even to a certain extent, inequalities. They still have some levers, but if you think about climate change, if the private sector doesn't get in, then you know, it won't happen. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, may be all in favor of the, you know, sign the Paris Agreement, do some regulation, impose a carbon tax, and do all sorts of things. But if the private sector doesn't get in, we won't achieve the reduction of emissions that we need to do in Canada. And you know, governments have very little resources to put in this. Like, look, Canadian example, 2 of our major banks, and I think it's a very good sign, have actually put, you know, a target of $100 billion each to actually be involved in low carbon emission, one by 2030 and one by 2025. And this is way more than public resources can do. Way, way more. So we've seen a shift. And these 2 banks, by the way, are TD Bank and the Royal Bank of Canada, and both are leading the markets in Canada. So it's actually not incompatible with the market leader's situation. Then another encouraging news that situation that I had was back to the pension funds. I was part of a discussion of a large group of pension funds from many countries a few weeks ago here in New York. And I was there for the first time, you know, based on what they had told me 3 or 4 years ago when they said to me, when I was making speeches, as I said before, they were saying, Marc-André, we're not going to be playing the role of government. And now they're actually, they spent 3 hours, in that meeting, they spent 3 hours saying, what's the role of pension funds in dealing with the world's biggest challenges, and how can we tackle them and help them? I thought that was a very, very rapid evolution. And I think that's what we're going to see. So, and I think as part of that, you have the SDGs. So the SDGs, I think, are getting more traction. Still part of a little group. I'm not one who pretend that the world is actually aligned with SDGs and all of that. But it's coming more and more as people look at it. It makes a lot of sense, and it's a good framework, and it's getting traction. Like, for example, I was the co-facilitator of the last high-level dialogue at the UN a few weeks ago for High-Level Week. And we were, so it was all about financing for development. And yes, we've talked about the traditional issues of illicit financial flow and the debt sustainability and all of that. But for half a day at the UN, we actually had the private sector coming to the table and talk about how we can work, the private sector, central bankers, member states, and work together. And that three years ago would not have been possible at the UN. And so I'm just saying it would not have been accepted by member state, and actually I'm not so sure the private sector would have seen their interest. But now everybody believes that there's an interest. I think that, not believes, I think that we can see a conversion of some interest. Whether we're going to get to the revolution that I hope we're going to get for, I think there are some indicators, but I agree with you. Then it gets to what Dr. Phelps talked about, the fact that maybe the market is rewarding not taking any risk and not being too audacious. I accept that as well, and I see that in my discussions with CEOs. But on the other hand, I think we have to talk more and more, and I think that's our role, people like us, to talk about the risk of not doing anything and the cost of it. And I think capital starts to understand it. There's always the free rider argument that Dr. Phelps is way better to address than I am as an economist, but I think we're going to get, we will need to get around that and that issue.
So Ambassador Blanchard, you've made the case today, you want a revolution, not evolution, given the urgency of the issues you outlined. But you make the observation that governments are limited in resources.
Yes.
And so in a sense, you're consistent in the plea or the encouragement for the private sector, the pension funds you talked about, to step up. You alluded to the CEOs we've talked about needing to be more, let's say, courageous or more bolder in their decisions. Professor Phelps mentioned that. Dr. Rodin talked about investments and the investment community being more innovative and examples of that. As the man from The Economist, a publication dedicated to free trade and certainly a big believers in capitalism, let me provide a contrarian thought to provoke our panel, because having three people agree, it makes a very boring panel. So I would put to you that what sustainable capitalism needs is more government, not less. That is, rather than begging poverty, as you do in the role of government, I would say that asking CEOs and companies to go beyond the remit of what companies can do in the absence of regulation. For example, going beyond current policies on carbon to fully account for the externalities that are involved in greenhouse gases. I would argue that is a role for government. Yes. Asking companies to go into the breach, for example, in the US.
It's
right?
not incompatible with
and like that, we can find 100 other examples. Asking companies, or even letting companies take on the mantle of deciding what is in the interest of stakeholders, actually usurps what should be done by governments. Only governments are elected by the people, at least in democratic countries. CEOs are not elected by anybody other than perhaps the board. And so if we collectively say companies should decide what's right for stakeholders, we may not like the choices they make, for example. However nice Paul Polman at Unilever was, a different kind of Paul Polman may make different choices that a democratic society may disagree with. So shouldn't this really call for more ambition in government?
Yes,
and not only for the private sector?
But I didn't say, I'm surprised that that's
I'm being provocative.
I don't think it's the Economist's view that you're...
No, we have called for externalities taxes, for example, consistently.
Yes, but like you've also talked for a lot of deregulation and less taxes in many ways, but like that, let's not have that debate now. It's
but just for the record, since you've invoked The Economist, the week that the Business Roundtable put out its documents, we had a cover story on the future, on the company, and the role of the company and CEOs, where we made this point quite forcefully. And I think many people who were in the stakeholder view were angered or were challenged by it. I happened to be on that day with the dean of one of the leading business schools in America. And after having read the cover story, which specifically made the point that the thinking and deciding what is right for stakeholders undermines, in a way, the democratic choices that government should be making. It abrogates responsibility. That's one of the risks. He said, you've given us a lot to think about. In other words, it challenged that point of view. So we were very much public in our view on this.
And for Canada, we recognize, and I work for a government that is actually has developed a carbon tax, for example. And we recognize, and I recognize personally, I believe in the role of government and an enhanced role of government in many ways. What I'm telling you, though, is that the private sector has way more resources than are available to the governments to resolve or to contribute to the solution or to the mitigation of some of the biggest challenges the world is facing now, which is climate change. And to a certain extent, there's also the issue of inequalities. And so we, like, for example, the private sector we need the technology of the private sector, we need the investment in the infrastructure of the private sector, we need to actually fight climate change successfully. Regulation and taxation by government will not be sufficient to do that in a short term. And that's why it's so important.
I too want to push back, because I tried to make the point that it was about resources and the magnitude of resources needed to solve these problems. I think none of this works unless government does what it's supposed to do, which is create policies that work, regulate where and how it is appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not to ask government to abrogate its role, but it is to say to corporations that the rapacious, and truly rapacious, actions that many corporations took in destroying the environment and not caring about its employees or its suppliers if they came from the developing world are not going to be tolerated in this new ecosystem. So they not only have a role in producing and using capital differently and more effectively to yield multiple outcomes, but that their behavior is going to be judged, not instead of government, but along with government. I'm not in favor of government, of political candidates who rail against big business or the corporations, because I don't think that that's a solution to our politics either. So I want to create an ecosystem in which people are doing better and more broadly what they ought to be doing to create more positive outcomes for a broader swath of the population. And that doesn't exclude government, it requires government.
Professor Phelps.
As I was listening
If you could use your microphone, sir.
discussion,
Could you use your microphone, please?
while I was listening to this fascinating discussion, I was wondering what will happen to private consumption and private investment if we reorient resources in these new directions. And I think that's a problem. I, for one, am happy to make the sacrifice. My consumption is already high enough, but on the whole in society, there are people who don't think that they can afford to get on less. And so this brings up the need for economic growth, which we've had very little of in this economy since about 1970. And I know all about Silicon Valley, but that's only a tiny, or it's only a smallish part of the economy. In the rest of the economy, you have a lot of stasis of nothing happening. So, which brings us back to the boldness thing, which I don't think we've addressed enough. In my book, Mass Flourishing, what I think is perhaps the most important theme is that the flourishing, the economic growth, the economic growth and the personal flourishing that we had from sometime in the early-ish part of the 19th century right up to the late 1960s, to do that, we needed to have people with the right stuff. And how did those, what was it about the people of that day that gave them that stuff? And I think that was that they were brought up with a fair amount of individualism. They were encouraged to exercise vitalism and to express themselves. You can see that in the 19th century, the culture resonated very much with the great books and their celebration of the heroes and so forth. And I think, talking about the public sector, we've got to get the public sector to spend an awful lot more on schools and to make sure that the schools bring students up on a diet of great books that will propel them into the world where they can have something that we might call the good life, a rewarding role to play in society.
You mentioned education. If we're talking about capitalism, and we're here literally on the doorsteps of one of the great business schools in the world here, Columbia, can I ask you, Professor, and I'll ask this to all of our panelists, what role should business schools, who churn out the future titans of industry, be playing in shaping this sustainable capitalism of the future? business schools stand accused in the wake of the Lehman crisis, for example, before that in the wake of the Enron crisis, of producing graduates who know how to meet the number, famously in the Enron case, but how to manipulate numbers and have financial success, but perhaps without the ethical grounding or the broad Renaissance education that might give a context of values and society and the public good. Is that an unfair and ridiculous charge, Professor? Since you are teaching here, maybe you can fly the flag for Columbia.
I'm here at Columbia, but I'm not an expert, but I'm not at the business school.
Fair point.
I'm really
fair
not
point.
an expert on the
But is it a
curriculum
fair challenge
but
to
I
business
dare
schools?
say that there would be room in present-day curricula for a little background work on what were they like, those great innovators of the past. What stuff did they have? What backgrounds did they have? What did they read? What did they celebrate and love and so forth? That wouldn't be, you could do a lot with just a little bit of fringe, a little bit of in the way of new courses, I think, to inspire as well as to equip and energize the student body so that they'll go out there and look for more exciting jobs.
And how about you, Dr. Rodin? When you ran the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton was within your remit,
Right.
one of the great business schools. How do you think about this question?
I think there was an inflection point where business schools changed their curricula by going out and finding what employers wanted. And so that's when teaching in groups emerged, because they wanted leaders who were able to lead teams and have groups. And many other elements, both of the curriculum itself and the style of education in business schools, were framed by what companies wanted. I think if we really are looking at this as a transformative moment, then two things can happen. One, CEOs will once again have the potential to play a role in the business school curriculum, and I think that is happening. But I also think that business schools have way opened themselves to the understanding that the breadth of the education, the breadth of the curriculum is something that is really very, very critical. I think they stand at a moment of real challenge. Many people, you just challenged a student who was applying to business school before we came up on the stage and said, you have a great job, you have a lot of experience, why in the world do you need an MBA? And I think that's a legitimate question, and more business schools need to confront that question and really ask how they're addressing it to create graduates who are able to lead in all sectors in the 21st century. I think that's critical.
I'm not qualified to comment on universities, except to say I think it's the diversity is very, very key of the students. Not only like the traditional diversity, but I also mean like making sure that like one thing that it's to have this discussion around risk that is very important for people in business school, in law schools, in other places. Understanding the complexity of what risk, the risks that we're all facing as a planet. I'll give you an example. The pension funds usually have no interest. So far, they've demonstrated no interest, or very little, with some exception, in investing in Africa. Well, if you look at Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's 17% of the population, more or less. It had, I think, less than, if I remember well, it has less than 1% of the investment in infrastructure are now made in sub-Saharan Africa. This is desperately needed in the context of ensuring our peace and security for the long term, not the long term, the midterm of the planet now. Look at what has happened in the Middle East, in Syria and Afghanistan in the last 7-8 years. You had basically 5 million people coming out of these two countries. And that has a very high correlation level with Brexit and the decision made by the British people to actually get out of the European Union. You would think that, you need people to understand these risks and they understand the impact of what it could have. And the business schools need to help pension funds understand that actually it is in the interest of everyone that when we give so much capital to such an institution, that they think about those risks. And I submit that there's a huge business opportunity. Half of the cities that will grow the most in the coming 20 years are in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a huge market for this. But there's a huge ignorance by Western institutions about these opportunities, and we tend to underestimate the opportunities, overestimate the risk, and then we have no investment. So the diversity of people is very key. Having met some people from these countries in our best business school is important, because that's how you're going to build trust, that's how you're going to build relationship, and that's how you're going to have more investment. If the private sector, if the capital of pension funds doesn't go more in frontier markets, for example, then you have the issue of inequalities that will come back to haunt us, the issue of climate change that will come back to haunt us, and the issue of geopolitics, because other countries that don't have the same values as us, let's put it this way, are actually not obeying by the same rules and actually seeing the situation the same way. So if we don't do anything, if we don't do it differently, I submit to you that we may not really like the world we could wake up in some years. And that's our obligation. Everyone has the obligation. Because just to finish on to come back to the resources needed to do what we need to be doing as a world, if the SDGs, everybody agrees it's between $5 and $7 trillion of investment a year to meet the SDGs. Everybody seems to agree that it's between 2 and 3 trillion in developing world that you need of investment to meet the SDGs, 2 to 3 trillion. The entire public resources put for investment in developing world are approximately $150 billion a year. So there's a huge gap. And you cannot, that's not public resources that will do that. We will need to do it through private resources.
Sure, very eloquently put. I think we have just a little bit of time for a quick question or two from the floor. Can we, I see a hand up right away?
I'll take the organizer's prerogative here and start. Thank you so much for a very, very thought-provoking panel, and I'm sure we could sit here all evening until the wee hours, as we'd say, where I come from, to cover these issues, which are absolutely critical. But let me put this to you, and I think we'll probably do a collective of questions and then have the panel answer these. Is there not more of an urgency to the situation than we're currently attributing? We're in a situation where, everyone is looking at economic data, everyone is looking obviously at political flows, at situations, the well-known geopolitical risk out there at the moment, and what we call geoflux here at Global Dream Forum. But there are really, for me, seem to be 2 or 3 critical points. The first thing is we're not necessarily defining accurately the issues at play. We're not necessarily even defining what we call the middle class, the lower class, and those in the so-called 1%. There are incredible tensions within all of those groups, which are not necessarily being fully revealed, and which will play out here in different geographies in different ways over time. But there is a certain urgency here that I think needs to come to play, and particularly as we look at the context of extremism, which is taken foot in the Western world, however we see it in different shapes and forms, there is certainly that one could see as an output of this lack of equality or this inequitable situation. And there's an urgency here that this be stopped, and that actually this is all stakeholders need to play and to come to the table and not just speak, as certain CEOs do very eloquently in order to push up their prestige, and certain government leaders, again, may actually put this forward as a key agenda issue without claiming they can do much. But there is a true urgency here to this, and this needs to be relayed. And what are the outputs, and what are the things that can be done in order to ensure that that urgency is put into play? That's one very broad but very important question. I'd like you all to come to that. Before I do that, I'll just pass over. I know we had one quick question over here, and then we'll allow...
Okay, we'll take both questions and the panelists can respond.
I'd like to say that.
He's answering urgently to your question.
I'd like to say that it's. I'm sorry, I've forgotten what I wanted to say about this.
We'll come back to you.
Yeah,
We'll come back to you in a moment.
okay, come back.
Let's have the other gentleman with this question.
Yes, hi. Kostas Simonenko here from CBS, MBA student. I actually grew up in Vancouver, and one of the big issues in Vancouver is housing, and it was like one of the first things. And my question is that one of the big sources of inequality is real estate. How the economy is changing now is that cities play a much larger role. They basically suck up all the talent and capital, and you have these knowledge sector, they're leaders in knowledge sector. So you have NYC, San Francisco, London.
Sure.
How do you see the public-private approach to fixing this issue?
Great. We happen to have a great expert on the cities of the future on our panel. In fact, so we have two questions. What I'll do, let's start with Dr. Phelps, and we'll give each of you a turn to answer.
I think the question points to the fact that we have so many social needs and we have so much dissatisfaction in the population. And a lot of that, not all of it to be sure, but a lot of that is because we've had tremendously slow growth for approximately 50 years. 50 years of slow growth is a very long time. And it used to be that whatever your problems were, rip-roaring growth tended to solve a lot of them. And now that is not the case. And also we have governments that are short of revenues because there's not much new revenue coming into their coffers, and as well as households not being able to meet their needs. So I think if we don't get the mainstream of the economy and the ordinary people who staff that part of the economy, if we don't get them going on all 6 or 8 cylinders, we're going to continue to have a very troubled society, and we won't be able to meet many of the goals that we've been talking about up here.
Ambassador, any last word?
Well, I think on the urgency, I'm not qualified to comment on this issue of city, but for me, the urgency is on recognizing that actually it's everybody's responsibility to deal with the issue of climate change and inequalities, and that actually let's not wait for government to be the solution to everything. We have, as individual and as corporations, we have in our society stakeholders that we all need to come together. And that's the beauty of the SDGs, is that it is recognized we're facing different challenges that we ever faced on this planet. In the past, we faced a lot of challenges that could be dealt with by governments or by individual corporations, unilaterally or bilaterally, and that sort of thing. Now the issues we're facing are systemic. So they need a systemic answers, and we need to recognize that. And we need to do partnerships in a way that we never thought we would do before. Like, I'll give you an example. It was not the idea of pension funds to say that they would actually partner for investing with the World Bank that much, besides buying some bonds or that sort of things. But now we will need to come together and work together in a way with the public sector, with the private sector, with the academia, with all sorts of NGOs and with different actors to actually do what we need to be doing. Take the example of the small island states. They did nothing to cause climate change, yet they're on the front line of the war against climate change. Their issue is an issue of survival. So we need to work with them together to actually deal with it. And it's urgent that we do so. So this is the kind of discussion that is urgent to have. And I think on that, I'm pretty inspired by what's happening throughout the world and the fact that We're talking about this new capitalism, the fact that for example, your publication or the FT or the New York Times, everybody is talking about this issue, the Business Roundtable, and I actually say that we're close to university here. I would like the universities to be even more aggressive on this. I actually believe this is one demand that I have, is that we need more thought leadership, because we need way more innovation and faster than we currently have. And I think our institutions have a big role to play in this.
Dr. Rodin, last word?
I won't reiterate the two very important comments and ways that the questions have been answered, but let me try to weave the two questions together in conclusion, because I do think that what we're seeing in the crisis in the cities is really in part the result of inequality. And so whether it's homelessness or no jobs or degradation of the environment, it's because the poorest people live in the worst places. They're the most impacted by disasters of all sorts, both natural disasters as well as economic and social disasters. And so they are growing together. But we have an opportunity. You mentioned Africa, Ambassador. Most of the growth of cities that will occur in the next 30 or 40 years will be in Africa and South and Southeast Asia. 40% of the infrastructure that will be built in the next 30 years does not exist now. 50% of the jobs that will be needed in these growing cities, where the density of the population will continue to vastly increase, need to be created. This is the moment in which we actually can determine how those cities grow, where the vast amount of the population will live. It won't be in Europe. I mean, the growth will not occur so much in Europe or the United States. It will occur in these regions. And so we have an opportunity to get it right, or an opportunity to get it horribly wrong. And at the moment, I think we're on the fulcrum of whether we will get it right or horribly wrong. And I will continue, and I think others of us will continue to push so that that fulcrum tips in the right direction.
All right, so you've heard an eloquent call to arms from our last speaker. I think you'll agree with me, we had a fascinating exploration of this urgent topic. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our wonderful speakers. Thank you very much.